Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Build Resilience in the Supply Chain. Before I hand over to our presenters today, just a few quick housekeeping points. To ensure the best experience for everybody and minimise background noise, all microphones are hopefully muted, but if yours isn't, please do take a moment to mute it now. But we do encourage interaction. So during the course of this presentation, if you have any questions at all, please submit these through the Q&A tab at the top, and we'll address these as towards the end of the session. This has been carefully planned, and we have got some time allocated at the end to answer your questions. This webinar is being recorded for those that are unable to attend the live session. The recording will be available in the member area within the next week or two. The webinar is also accredited for CPD for 1 hour. So all attendees today will be sent a CPD certificate of attendance. Just allow a few working days for that to arrive. And then finally, if you experience any technical issues at all, please do pop a note in the chat and I'll do my best to assist. Next slide, please, Ryan. So moving on to today's session, our presenters, who will introduce themselves in a moment, are the authors of 2 new supplier management resources that are now available in the member library. We have an updated ABC supplier management guide, and we've also got a supporting technical supplement which explores emerging cybersecurity regulations, contract clauses, data classifications. And today's webinar is going to draw on both of these new resources. I appreciate we may have some non-members joining us today, so I'll be sending download links after this session so you can easily access these resources. I hope to be able to do this later today or possibly tomorrow. And that's it for me. I'm now going to hand you over to our speakers for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dom. I'll start. My name's Ryan Hyde. I'm a senior cyber consultant for the Cyber Risk Management Group. I've been in cyber for around 15-ish years now. Spent quite a bit of time doing all things governance, risk and compliance for HSBC. Spent a few years as the lead for the third-party risk management team for Anglo American. And for the last few years, I've been working with CIIMG. I'll pass over to Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew Richardson. I'm a CIISec fellow, and I've been involved in the ABC guides since their inception, I think 4 or 5 years ago. We're currently in the process of bringing them all up to date. This is a supplier management one. We've done executive board, and we're just about to start the human resources one. So watch out for future webinars. It's really Ryan and Mark that the experts here today in terms of supplier management. I'm here for a bit of consistency through the ABC guides. So over to Mark.
Cheers, Andrew. Oh yeah, I'm Mark. I work at Ageas Insurance. I've been working at Ageas Insurance for over 20 years. I've been in the third-party risk management space for around 5 years. Part of my role as an architect and insurance specialist is to lead on the development, the deployment, maintenance, and the governance of third-party risk management, or as it could also be known, due diligence or supplier assurance. Hopefully what follows over this webinar will help bring to life the guides that we've helped refresh and bring up to date.
Okay, just to quickly talk about the ABC guides again, they're primarily intended for non-security professionals or to help security professionals in their conversations and interactions with other people. And we see this particular guide being useful for a number of elements in supplier management in terms of selection, contract negotiations, security alignment, ongoing supplier management, and managing cloud and AI services. Ryan.
Thanks, Andrew. So the hopefully these guides will allow you to, so whenever you're, whichever part of the process you're in with regards to supplier management, this guide will have something for you. So whether you're really early on in your maturity of supply management, whether you've been doing it for years and you wanted to mature, this guide will have something for you for all elements. So wherever you are in the supply chain process, beginning to end, this supply chain supply management guide and technical supplement will have something for you to be able to help you mature your own processes.
Cheers, Ryan. And to add to that, I think give you a high-level overview of some of the sort of new and enhanced areas in the guide. We've got expanded regulatory guidance, which covers the new frameworks like DORA and NIS2 and the recent UK Cyber Act. We've got enhanced supplier assessments as well. So it's around the risk-based approach to due diligence and the sort of the clear supplier categorization, or some people might call it tiering, and the new technology advances around OSINT and AI and how that works. We've also got a bit about cloud risk and responsibility. It's just about understanding who's responsible for what and not making the assumption. And then in addition to that, we've got enhanced cloud security measures, which is around segregation, tenant isolation, and a few other controls. And we've got some continuous monitoring and case studies, including audits. And there's also some high profile cyber incidents, which will follow on a couple of slides, just to make you aware that there's also a section around AI risk management, and it's sort of the alignment with some of the new standards that are coming out or that are out, like ISO 42001, the EU AI Act, and the NIST framework. But yes, there's a lot to cover in the refresh.
Okay, so let's start with the big picture then. The guide highlights multiple real-world examples from credential compromise to ransomware hitting aviation systems, all showing how suppliers can be an entry point for serious disruption. So, Mark, Ryan, looking at the recent cyber incidents, which types of supplier risk do you see organisations still underestimating?
I think, if you don't mind, Mark, I'll kick off. One of the areas, there's many, but one of the areas I think is supply. Obviously, we're talking about the supply chain, but they're like the fourth parties, the fifth party, so further down the supply chain. So we should hopefully be very aware of the publicity that incidents that was happening last year. One of them was quite a big car company. I'll not mention who they are. You probably already know who they are. But that the incident that they had a massive impact on their supply chain. So not just impacting them and their manufacturing, so that heavily impacted their manufacturing, but also the people and the companies that were supplying them with products, because they weren't developing the vehicles, they weren't needing the components to actually be able to develop the vehicles. So that massively impacted their supply chain. So that's one way, but also when you're assessing your suppliers down that supply chain. So if your supplier has potential issues that could impact your supplier, how is that going to affect you? So I think that's one area that is still underestimated. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I think in addition to that, you've also got the fact that some vendors or suppliers in the supply chain still probably haven't got some of the, what we probably refer to as the basics covered off. So there are still, so part of the supplier assurance or due diligence or third-party risk management work that you do with your vendors, you need to be checking that they've got the sort of the basics covered. So for instance, it's not unusual still to find some businesses that aren't using MFA or SSO for some connections in. They're still using basic authentication with sort of low unenforced password policy. So it's good to do the due diligence on those vendors to understand what their posture is like. And when you've got the opportunity to then interject and work with them to improve and mature that, you're not only improving those vendor security postures, but you're also improving it for everybody in the industry who works with those vendors moving forward. So it's although you're making a small change to a relationship, you'll find that will just trickle down across the other sectors who use that vendor as well.
And the guide mentions hidden pathways where cyber threats enter via suppliers. In your experience, what makes these pathways so hard to spot?
I think some of that is trust blind spots. So what I mean by that is if a supplier has been air quotes approved, they may not be as stringently reviewed or so assessed. So they like the traffic from any suppliers might be like an allow listed on the firewall. Supply VPNs might bypass some security controls because those suppliers are seen as trusted. So I think that areas like that will have a massive impact on and those hidden pathways. I think those will have a massive impact there.
Yeah, agreed. Completely agree.
Yeah, obviously with things like cloud suppliers, where it's underpinning thousands of businesses, we have a concentration risk. How should organizations interpret and manage this risk?
Concentration risk. So an example of this, I suppose, would be the aviation impact incident that we had last year. So a lot of airports booking systems went down because they were all using the same supplier for those booking systems. How you would deal with that, how you would maybe address that, talking to each other. So in the past, you would generally not companies or peers in the industry, you wouldn't really approach them to talk to them about your security. Now it's becoming more relevant for you to contact those and almost have a relationship so you can talk about what you're seeing across the industry, your particular sector of the industry, who you're using, so you don't get that concentration risk. And using that as an example, the airports and the booking systems, that's a perfect example because all those airports weren't able to manage the bookings because they were all using the same supplier. If they were all using something different, they wouldn't have as much of an impact, and it wouldn't be as regional as what it was in that particular incident.
And I think to add to that as well, if you're a business, so sort of bring it right, you've obviously covered it from many businesses using the same supplier, but equally, if you're a business who just runs off of Microsoft and nothing else, then potentially you're putting yourself at risk as well. Whereas if you try and dilute that down by using other suppliers to do some of that work, which may be around, I don't know, EDR work, email security, etc., it might not necessarily cost you any more or any less really, but then you've got a bit more resilience built in. So some of your business can still operate if one of the big three, for instance, do have a glitch, which we're seeing there's more and more occasions of that happening in the last year or so. So yeah, it's not only about choosing different suppliers within your organization, but it's also trying to sort of, if one vendor is down, then obviously it has an impact to many other suppliers. So it's a hard one to balance. But I know some people just choose one particular vendor because they see there's cost savings there. But in reality, if you actually explore sort of diluting that down across different relationships, then you may find that if there is an additional or a small additional cost there, that you're still actually giving yourself more resilience, which sometimes allows your business to still operate to some degree if there is an outage in one area.
Brilliant. Okay, let's move on to the next slide then. So the guide outlines several systemic challenges: lack of coordination between business functions, inconsistent supplier selection approaches, over-reliance on certifications, and growing regulatory burden. So the guide stresses poor coordination between procurement, legal, security, and the business. Why does this misalignment occur so often?
I think sometimes teams in businesses can work in silos, which probably doesn't help the conversation.
Yeah.
I think working together more often or more frequently would enable each other to understand what each other is doing. So a way could be of having a monthly meeting or catch up within those departments just to discuss any new relationships that are on the horizon, if there's any contract renewals, or equally if you're changing the way in which you're using a vendor. Because if you're changing the way in which you're sharing data or possibly giving them more data, then you might need to then do some more due diligence and greater assessment or level of scrutiny on that vendor. So I would say if you can try and work together with those teams and have a monthly, bi-monthly meeting with them, I think that will massively improve the relationship between those parties.
Nothing to add there. I completely agree. That's one of the biggest things that I see when I'm working with new clients in this area. It's that siloed approach. They're doing their thing. We're doing our thing. They're not talking to each other. But yeah, that committee style workshop on a monthly basis, just to get everyone talking to each other, everyone's familiar with who each other are, so they know if they do have a particular problem or they need to talk to procurement, they know who to go to. If they need to discuss contract clauses, they know who to go to in legal. Having that coordination across all the teams involved with the supply chain is key, definitely.
Yeah, I think having those key contacts within the teams is probably a good way of drawing in, and those will be those people that you meet on a regular basis and can bounce ideas off or questions off. But yeah.
So really about forming good relationships within the business and linking everybody up. Great. Why is the one-size-fits-all approach to supplier assessments so problematic?
I'll go for this one, Mark, if that's all right. It's because you can't boil the ocean. I know it's a cliche and you've probably heard it before, but you can't do it. So having that one size fits all causes a massive strain on your resources, especially if you've got hundreds, potentially thousands of suppliers. More companies now having thousands of suppliers in their supply chain. You can't assess them all. Unless you've got dozens of people to be able to actually perform the assessments, you're not going to be able to do it. So introducing, and I'm jumping a bit here because we will talk about this in a later slide, but introducing a risk-based approach so you perform a business impact analysis. You understand which suppliers are your most critical suppliers, the highest risk to the business, and you spend the time and the resource that you've got looking at the most important ones, the highest risk, the most critical to the business area, and you perform the assessment and the supply chain assurance on those suppliers. The lower risk ones you can come to at a later date or as and when you get more resource, but introducing that tiering system, essentially that risk-based approach, I would suggest 3 tiers at least, and then you can look at everything changes there. So your tier 1, you will be looking at on a more regular basis because they're more critical to the business. You might assess them once a year, for example. You capture more evidence, so you're focusing and you're using the resource that you've got to focus on the most important suppliers to you.
And what I would add to that as well, Ryan, is although you do have, let's just say you have a tiering assessment and you've got 3 or 4 tiers within your business, just because a business is a tier 3 or a tier 4, it doesn't mean they're not they don't have an important relationship with your business, because potentially a tier 3 vendor could be down there because of the spend, maybe, depending on how you categorize your tiering. But then essentially it could be maybe, I don't know, let's say for insurance purposes, it's a supplier for motor vehicles. They could process or hold at any point tens of hundreds of thousands of customer details. So although they may be a tier 3, you still may assess them more at a tier 2 level when it comes to the due diligence and the assessment, because there's a greater risk because they hold and process more data. So it's a real balancing act, but just to add to that.
Yeah, I would argue, sorry to slightly disagree with you, Mark, but if they are holding customer data, it depends on what type of data it is, but they're holding tens of thousands of volumes of customer data, they might need to be brought up into a higher tier, as an example. So then there's a more stringent assessment against them because they are holding a lot of customer data.
And the tiering that you've mentioned, that you go into more detail later, is obviously how organisations are trying to balance the commercial efficiency with the need for these vigorous security checks.
So I think the mistake here is that assuming that those are mutually exclusive. So commercially efficient and rigorous security checks, there needs to be a mature approach to design a process so that security becomes an enabler for that. So we're not having a negative impact on the commercial efficiency, but there's still a sufficiently rigorous security check against that particular supplier. That's where the coordination between all the different teams and all the different elements within the supply chain process as a whole helps. So it allows that, and hopefully if you're working with procurement, and getting engaged earlier so that you can have a more effective process. There is a fine balance. It's not a science, it's more of an art, but it is possible.
Independent attestations like ISO or SOC 2 are often treated as maybe a bit of a silver bullet. What are the pitfalls of relying too heavily on these?
I'm happy to start on this one if you like, Ryan. So
Yeah,
for
okay.
me, ISO certificates, when you're reviewing a vendor and they've got an ISO certificate, it's fantastic that they're showing you that. It does show a level of maturity there, as does any auditable certificates such as Cyber Essential Plus and upwards, including the SOC reports, etc. But all you've got to do is make sure the service you're receiving from the vendor matches the scope of that ISO certificate. And also when you do get those certificates through, ask for the annexes from the suppliers as well, because that then covers all the other sites that certificate covers. SOC 2 is beneficial. It is an auditable document, so it's great to see that all those controls have been tested. But nothing beats probably a combination of the certifications, a good assessment, and some effectiveness and some, what's the other word I'm looking for? Evidence-based assessment with the vendor as well, just to complement that, to do a sort of full circle. So you're not just relying on the certificate. Equally, you could get a service from a vendor where the SOC, they give you the SOC 2 report, but the service they're providing to you, again, the SOC 2 report, the scope of that doesn't match what you're getting from the vendor. So it is almost, not completely, but it's not the document you would necessarily want to look at and rely on, because the test hasn't been across, or the audit hasn't been across the service you're getting from the vendor.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it does provide a level of comfort,
yeah,
and a level of maturity, but it doesn't cover everything. So there may be controls as well that you've got in place within your organisation that's not covered in ISO or SOC 2, but it's they're the controls. There's some controls that you want to see in place, so you could use that and then do a supplementary assessment. So anything that's not covered in ISO, for example, you can ask some additional questions to make sure that you've got a level of comfort that those controls are in place. And again, as Mark's mentioned, capturing evidence to support it as well, to reinforce the assessment that you're performing.
And I think the financial, if you're operating in financial services particularly, the PRA and the FC would expect you not to rely on just certificates, especially for a higher tier vendor. You've got to do that assessment that's proportionate for the relationship. So you need to do that additional scrutiny. You need to ask those questions. You can't just get someone to waive a certificate and just expect that to sort of a bit of a tick box exercise. It doesn't always quite work like that. Can work sometimes for your lower tier vendors, can make that process somewhat quicker, but your higher tier ones that need that extra rigor, extra scrutiny.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Let's move on to the next slide. You hinted earlier about the 6-stage approach. So, Ryan, Mark, do you want to take us through this
Yeah.
six stage. It's easy for me to say, isn't it? 6-stage approach that's in the guide. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Bear with me. I'll move on to the next slide and we'll go through these step by step. So stage one, this is right at the beginning, ideally working with procurement, understanding what the business need. So they've come to you and procurement saying, we need a supplier to do this particular job. We need to outsource. So here, yeah, as it says, you determine the requirement for a product or service. Now, this is also where ideally you would scope out the service, what information is being captured, is it being hosted, are they accessing your network, are they taking the data away and hosting it locally, if they are accessing your network, how they're accessing your network. So you do your scope, and you'd also do the business impact analysis here as well. So though that criteria that I mentioned earlier to introduce that tiering process, that risk-based approach, you'd understand what impacts an incident would have on the business for several different impact categories, and again, depending on what criteria you've set up, that will then dictate what tier and how rigorous the subsequent assessments are. Anything to add on that one, Mark?
No, not really. No, I think you've covered everything there.
Thank you. And then stage two. So this is generally where procurement's going out to determine potential suppliers. So there may be several suppliers that provide this the service that you're looking for. They would do some research to understand who those are. You may already have a supplier that does this work for a different business area that you would prefer to engage with. If so, great. If not, it's the opportunity to then to go out to tender, essentially. So the information you've captured in stage one, again, the scoping that service, understand the impacts to your business, that information will be used to go out to the potential suppliers, so that they can understand your needs, what your requirements are, and for them to build a proposal for you guys to assist in review. Now, not everyone is involved, so not all third-party risk management assurance teams are involved with procurement at this stage. If that's the case, don't worry about it. It is the ideal scenario, but we understand pragmatically it's not always possible to do. Ideally, if you can get some involvement with procurement on the suppliers that are being onboarded earlier, you can give them the heads up. So security isn't just like a box ticking exercise after a contract's been signed. You can have some input. So that's essentially what stage 1 and 2 is for, is to help procurement and guide them towards a more secure supplier. Stage 3 and 4 then. So stage 3 is the RFP and RFQ. So these are essentially, could be questionnaires, some pre-questions that you can ask the suppliers. Can be things like we mentioned earlier about the ISO and the SOC reports. You can ask if they have them, whether they're willing to share them, what documents they've got, and whether they're willing to share. This is later down the line, but you kind of just asking if they've got that level of assurance already. And then that gets put into the procurement pack that goes out to the suppliers for them to come back with a proposal. So you are essentially setting your security requirements to the supplier. Here's what here's the type of things we're going to be looking at, here's what we're expecting of you, and how they respond to that. So there'll be an initial evaluation as part of stage 4. So the different ways of doing this, so you can have an initial questionnaire, maybe 10 questions, just understanding their, essentially what trying to get a gauge of what their posture is. And then afterwards, once you understand that, you can use that to scope a bespoke security questionnaire that goes into a lot more detail, or you could just give them the questionnaire for them to respond, and then you can assess them all. That obviously is more resource intensive. Not everyone is able to apply the amount of people needed to assess that. So in that scenario, you could be performing assessments of 3 or 4 suppliers, with procurement only picking the one at the end of it. So not everyone's happy about doing that. Not a problem if you don't. It is an option, and again, this is why some companies do have those 10 pre-questions, just trying to get a feel for their maturity, and give that back to the business area and say, look, these have got all the certifications and areas that we're looking for. This will probably be the best supplier, and then they take that on board with everything else, commercials, all the other things, procurement, taking, and to make a decision on whether they go with a particular supplier. So stage 4, mentioned it briefly, but yeah, this is where you are performing those security assessments, capturing evidence where possible, and delving into their security controls in a lot more detail. And again, you're going back to procurement with the responses, like this supplier, depending on how you score your output, this supplier scored this amount, this supplier scored this is showing a more mature security posture. We would recommend this. However, the decision is still with them to make. Essentially, you're giving them advice. There's not many times I've seen security say you have to stop your relationship with that supplier. It's happened a few times. I've seen in financial services, not very often, and that's only when they've had enough clout, enough clout to say, we're not going to work with you anymore because your security controls are so low.
I think to add to that is what I'd say with the RFP questions as well is, if you could try to have something that maps and aligns to your due diligence questionnaire as well, to some degree, it helps you probably cherry pick some of those questions with some of those vendors. Once you understand the relationship from the earlier stages of 1 or 2, you can then help sort of tailor, you almost like a bit of a pick list. You just fire off the questions you need to that vendor, and it doesn't have to be using a GRC tool. It could be something simple like Word or Excel. There's no right or wrong tool to use. I think having a master set of questions that cover all different suppliers is probably a great way to start. If you haven't got that, then I'll go to what Ryan was saying earlier, maybe just have 10 or 15 high-level assurance questions that you need to have in place around certification controls, their approach to security, their investment in it, whether they align to best practice, what frameworks they align to, if they've got policies, all those types of questions to help you sort of get an understanding of what the vendor's like. And then once the supplier's been evaluated, something we can appreciate is you don't always, as an information security person, get the vendor you necessarily want, because your score is one of many that feed into that. So you may prefer vendor A overall and vendor B and C is less secure, and then the business chooses B or C for the overall scoring. And all it means is that when you do come to do the due diligence at stage 5 and 6 onwards, you'll know already where some of your sort of focus will be on that assessment, because you already know where the sort of potential gaps are that you're looking to have further conversation with that vendor around, either addressing or getting some clarification where it probably wasn't overly clear through the RFP documentation and words that were shared in that.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Just to pick out one point there that Mark made, a good point. If you have the ability to make the questions bespoke, so if you're, depending on what information you've captured in the scoping of stage 1 and 2, if you're able to essentially send the questions that are relevant to them. So if you know, based off that scope, which questions to send, and you're not sending irrelevant questions, that will be better if you have that ability. You're not going to wind them up by asking them irrelevant or silly questions that way, and that will actually help towards the next stage. Anything on stage 3 or 4 before I move on, Mark?
Nothing further, thanks.
No. Cool, thank you. So yeah, what I was mentioning there about having bespoke controls based off what you've scoped, so understanding their infrastructure, you can apply that same logic to the terms, to the schedule, contract, whatever term you want to use. You may have some basic security requirements that goes into the contract. I would suggest the higher the tier, the more critical they are to you, having a more bespoke set of contract terms, and again using that understanding of what's in scope, what their environment's like, will cater towards making a more bespoke list of contract terms. And then the lower the risk, you can probably just rely on some pretty standard security requirements. But going back to an earlier slide and about the cooperation, this is where cooperation with legal becomes quite relevant as well. So when they are negotiating the terms with the suppliers, having input on those terms will be quite significant for you guys, especially when you're wanting to mature your service.
I think also the terms in which you add in your security clause, or whatever you call it, your schedule, your annex, the addendum really to the main contract, really it should be your own security schedule of sorts. Within that should be your minimum baseline requirements for a business to be able to work with you, outlining your requirements around minimum levels of encryption, making sure they don't use deprecated protocols, etc., weak ciphers and things like that. This is your time to get your foundational requirements in with the vendor. And a lot of that work should have almost been done throughout the initial RFP and then through the due diligence stage. So you should know whether we'll have any issues with that. But then when you do have those baselines, if there is a pinch point with the vendor, you work it through, you speak with your legal representative, and you understand if you can either put a treatment plan in place if there's a shortfall, or you understand if there's something in the future of the roadmap. And if there is, then probably it's best to write that into the contract as well, so that you've got that to reference back to and then track that throughout the duration of the treatment plan or the roadmap.
Yeah, agreed. And then stage 6, so this is receive and maintain product or service. So essentially everything's complete. You've performed your assessment, contract's been signed, and it's a case of monitoring the security of that particular supplier. Now if you can get involved, if you've got a threat intelligence team and work with those guys, especially again the most critical suppliers, if you ask them to monitor those, working with threat intelligence is quite a strong set of data. There's open source intelligence. That's a possibility for you to use, but there's also things like, and again based off what tier your particular supplier is, how critical they are, will dictate how often you revisit the assessment. So, for example, if it's your most critical supplier, you might revisit it every 12 months. If it's a low risk, you might look at it every 3 to 5 years. You can set that criteria.
I can jump in quickly.
No,
What you think,
brain,
if you
yeah,
like,
you
Mike?
jump in. I had a brain
Yeah,
freeze there, mate. Sorry.
I think when obviously you've got your higher tier relationships as well, or vendors, you'll more than likely have a relationship owner that manages that relationship. So as part of that maintenance package and ongoing support, there's probably going to be some governance check-ins with the vendor, whether that's monthly, bi-monthly, quarterly. And as part of that, what you should have is maybe a standing agenda where information security is on there. What you can do is you could include maybe something like a security health check question set. So it could just be a series of maybe 8 or 10 questions covering some basic topics like patch compliance, access reviews within compliance, DPL, alerts and investigations closed within certain SLAs. Also any incidents, an overview, they've all been reviewed, actioned and closed within policy SLAs, etc. It's just a good touch point for ongoing assurance. And equally, if an ISO certificate, PCI certificate, SOC report, etc., is out of date or nearly out of date, or a Cyber Essentials Plus, they can also then feed that into that agenda with the ongoing governance checks to request those new certificates and documents, so that you've got those touch points throughout the relationship and not just doing the review every sort of couple of years or so.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. So the point that I had a brain freeze on was contract termination. So so again, Mark mentioned there that these services will generally have an owner or some sort of risk owner, working with them. So essentially getting a trigger from them when the contract's up for renewal, and then working with them to ensure that any data that a particular supplier has access to is either returned, deleted appropriately, depending on its classification, things like that. So to ensure that your data is safe, even after the contract's term, they have a responsibility to ensure that data is safe. And ensuring them that is happening is key. That can also be related into stage 5 and actually keeping that in the negotiation terms, the contract terms, and also incident reporting as well, things like that. So if there's an incident, who do they report to? How soon do they have to report to? Things that can be part of the agenda items that Mark mentioned, and also part of the contract terms as well.
Excellent. So we're falling slightly behind time. So that was a great description of those 6 stages. Let's move on to the next slide, because I know there's questions waiting for us at the end here. So AI is on everybody's lips these days, and the guide explains how technology can streamline processes, but it also highlights that AI is difficult to assure its accuracy. So where do you see AI adding real value, and where is it currently too risky to rely on?
I'm happy to start if you like, right?
Well, yeah, sorry, yeah. Mark. Yeah, go ahead.
That's fine. So I think, although AI is obviously the buzzword in the last year or two, it feels generally like it's in its infancy for most people within the business. There are definitely some efficiencies to be gained from using AI. No one can research a document quicker than AI, but is it accurate? That's the human in the loop element, which I think we need to keep in there for a while. Also, it can be used for repetitive or repeated tasks. There is a value there. I think some GRC tools, if you're able to have one in your business, do offer some AI agents or even some AI assessments. I believe one of the market leaders out there already, if you send a fill in a completed assessment review, including document certificates, policies and standards, etc., it will do a complete review, read all the documents, and give you an output. I haven't seen this yet, but it's something that I'm certainly going to be looking at the next expo when I go to one later this year. And I know of something we're trialing ourselves as well. It's also the look and the use of some homemade agents within Microsoft as well, just to understand what the art of the possible is. But I think with all of this, you need guide rails. You need a policy around AI. You need some controls there, because you shouldn't be certainly allowing people to use AI that's just publicly available. It should be enterprise. It should be approved. It shouldn't be something someone can just download off the internet and start using, because there is a danger that if we start ingesting our own data into those platforms, it potentially ends up in the public domain, which is what we don't want. So I think if you have an expert in your area, in your business around AI, you're looking to use it, then I would certainly encourage you to have conversations with those people just to understand what the boundaries are, if there's a sandbox environment you can play with, and what the limits and the scope of the use of those tools can be used for, and then slowly grow as you mature.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you're looking at the developers of the AI as a supplier. If you're going to be putting quite sensitive data into AI, you're going to want to make sure that there's the controls from the supplier at the back end of this, and that so do you do due diligence. AI assurance is key. Make sure you do due diligence of the supplier or the developer that's actually developed the AI that you're going to be using.
Okay, fantastic. Let me move on to a closing question for both of you really to answer. If an organization could only improve one aspect of its supplier risk management tomorrow, where would you advise them to start?
If they're going to improve one, I would say that's pretty quick and has a high impact. I think one of the improvements that we mentioned quite early on is developing that coordination and that relationship with the different members of different teams within the supply chain. So procurement, legal, all working with you guys in security, developing that and nurturing that relationship.
Yeah, I had collaboration in my mind as well. I think if you haven't got it already, then maybe try and think of introducing a pipeline like the developers do when they do their work, where you have an onboarding of a vendor and try and map it through like a snake, so you understand who you need to contact at what point, and all the points we've discussed throughout 1 to 6 can feed into that flow, as you will, and with it, and then part of that would be communicating with your fellow peers at the appropriate time. That can help really structure an onboarding or a re-tiering or another due diligence of a vendor because of the relationships changing or evolving. So yeah, I'd agree with you completely. I think collaboration is the key, but also mapping it out so everyone understands at what point everyone does what, and then maybe have some sort of stage gates in there. So if a due diligence, for argument's sake, isn't completed, then we don't sign the contract. It's making sure we've got the safety nets in place as well, so that things don't go ahead. I appreciate some businesses might ask for forgiveness and just crack on, get something signed, and then go, by the way, you probably should do something on this retrospectively. That shouldn't really be the way it works in the modern world. We should be making sure everyone follows a process and a flow. It's going to happen, things slip through nets, but if we can put as many safety nets in there between the right thing and the wrong thing, then hopefully you can capture most things that way.
You can't,
sorry, Andrew,
always fix forward, can you?
Just to add to that, I know you only asked for one, but I would also suggest, I'm going to give you a second. Sorry,
give us a second one.
But I would also introduce that risk-based approach, especially if you're trying to boil the oceans. Mentioned earlier, you haven't got the resource to hit every single supplier that comes through. Introducing that tiered approach, introducing that risk-based approach will help you massively.
Excellent. Look, thank you both. We've really explored some of the real-world dangers of supplier cyber risk management and the challenges that organisations are facing across the procurement cycle. I hope people will find the ABC guys useful and offer a good framework to base things on. I've been kind of watching with one eye, and seems like lots of questions are coming. So, Dom, over to you. Could you feed any questions through that we may have in the last few minutes we've got?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Ryan, and thanks, Mark. That was a really good session. So, quite a few questions have come through via the chat and the Q&A. So I'll pick out a couple. James has asked, how far down the supply chain do we need to go as part of a review? When do you get to the end?
For me, I'm happy to start with that one. So for me, you should really be looking at your third parties. If there are fourth parties in that chain or fifth parties, but then I rely on the contracts and I have trickle down clauses. So if in my security schedule, should we say, or security contract, that there are certain expectations or baselines, I expect that to follow down to my third parties, so on and so forth. Because otherwise you'll be like, say, you'll be there forever and a day. If you've got those trickle down clauses, then that puts it on the third party to make sure that they're doing the right thing for their vendors as well. And you sort of hold them to account. It's contractually sort of locked in as well then. And part of your due diligence question should be around what do they do when they onboard their vendors. But yes, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I think the most common approach that I've seen is understanding if they have, so you're performing a third-party risk assessment, understanding if they've got a similar process for their suppliers. And I suppose it does depend on what industry you're in, because if you're in critical national infrastructure and you find, and so you might only want to go down two tiers or two levels of suppliers. But if you find out that level 4, level 5 is getting equipment from China for some reason, and that's not acceptable to you, then so it does depend per company as to what you do and how critical that particular supplier is as well. That again, that risk-based approach, you can, the higher the tier, the higher the criticality, the more stringent you need to go down. But again, what Mark mentioned there, understanding what they do with their suppliers, what level of assessment they perform, what due diligence they do, is probably the most cost-effective way of doing it.
Well, thank you. Talking about suppliers, Rachel's asked about the best way to establish criticality of a supplier, i.e. how to decide what tier they would fit in. Any advice?
Having a harm table, so business impact table. So it's essentially a matrix where you've got all your different risk categories and different levels of harm. You might have reputational, operational, financial impacts, things like that. And any suppliers that are in the highest level of impact is one way of doing it. Is also looking at if you're in an industry that has customer data, maybe the types of customer data, if you've got a classification system on the types of data, or you look at the volumes as well. So there's lots of elements that you can look at to make a decision on criticality.
I would agree completely with what you've said there. And rather than answer the question, I'm going to suggest what you shouldn't base it on. And you shouldn't base it on just the value of the contract. And I know sometimes that's a relatively easy route and an easy assessment to make, but I don't think it gives you the full picture, and it doesn't give you the picture you need. I think that aligns with what you were saying, Ryan. Mark, do you have anything to add on that? Oh, sorry, Ryan.
No, sorry, go on. Okay.
Nothing further for me to add on that, guys. No.
Yeah, no, what I was going to say, Andrew, was that quite often I've seen suppliers that didn't cost a lot, that have got access to highly restricted customer data, like really sensitive data, high volumes of it, but weren't placed in a higher criticality because of the financial costs of the service. We need to take a lot more information on board, and I think you're right. Just relying on financial cost isn't enough. Nowhere near.
I think that links back to stage 1 and 2 of the process, doesn't it? When you're understanding that relationship, and I think if you get some responses back and they're not clear, then have a conversation with that relationship owner just pick up the phone, have a Teams call, and just ask them to expand on it. If you think, oh, okay, we could be sat on a fence here, this could be an important business function, or quite critical to the business, or they could have access to a great deal of information or sensitive systems. So if you're unsure, then just have a conversation with someone, because sometimes people can fill in the form quickly because they're in a rush, and sometimes quickly isn't good enough for you. So you need a bit more sort of context and substance to the answers.
Well, I'm going to see if we can squeeze in one more. So Daniel asked, when assessing a new supplier, how can external attack surface management be used to evaluate their security posture?
I have had experience where a vendor that we have a relationship with scans our external domain before it does any due diligence on us, and it gives us an output. And that output, along with scorecard and some other bits and bobs that they use, it then shows us any vulnerabilities that they see on our external domain, and then asks us as part of the assessment to then feedback and respond with any findings that, for instance, that are medium or higher in criticality. And then we have a conversation with our internal teams to understand if they're false positives or if they're valid, because obviously what they can see, anyone else can see in the world, and that makes you potentially an easier target. So yes, I suppose the answer is people can scan your domains. People can use other tools such as scorecard, but like with anything, you have to get the context of how the business is run to understand sometimes the output of these tools. But those are some of the ones I've seen used in the real world. I don't know, Ryan, whether you've seen anything additional.
No, I haven't. I agree with what you're saying, but I haven't actually, no.
Yeah.
Well, we're 1 minute to 3 o'clock. So, Andrew, Ryan, Mark, I'd really like to thank you for your planning and presenting today's webinar, and also for writing these new resources that, as I said, are up on the member area now. Thank you very much for attending this webinar, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Cheers all. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.